Welcome to the Church of Logic. My name is Cody Rue, and today I will talk about paradox. Last time we were in the late 19th century. We talked about Frege's work on establishing a calculus for logic and basing all of human mathematics and even possibly science on just these mechanical rules to derive truths. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, this did not end perfectly well. All these beautiful rules ended up having a contradiction. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the rules and why they resulted in contradiction, but also what contradiction is and why it's such a bad thing to have in a logical formalism. Now, I think it's intuitive to everybody that being contradictory is not a good thing in everyday life, right? If you believe things that are incompatible with each other, usually that's a bad thing. But, why is it a bad thing? In everyday life, usually you want to be able to have a good notion of what's true and what's not true. And you also have an intuitive notion that if something is true, then some other things can't possibly be true, right? My car can't be parked outside and also, downtown. There are things that have to be incompatible. But what about mathematics? In everyday life, we have to recognize that, yeah, sometimes we believe things that aren't true, and sometimes we believe things that are incompatible with each other. And it's not always dramatic, right? We can have these views that are kind of in tension with each other, but that doesn't really, prevent us from living our lives, especially if those beliefs are relatively remote, are things that aren't immediate to our everyday activities. In mathematics, the situation is a lot worse. In general, if you've proven something in mathematics and you've also proven its negation or something that's incompatible with it, say you've proven that 0 equals 1, or you've proven that some number is less than 0 and also greater than 0, then you're in bad shape. In general, what happens is you can prove anything, right? And that is definitely not what you want. Being able to say that anything is true is, to quote, that line from The Incredibles, is the same as saying that nothing is true. You have no valid logical calculus if you can assert that anything is true and prove it, right? This is not what math is about. In math, some things are provable, some things are not provable. Some things are true, some things are not true. And we want to be able to build a calculus that has some not true things, some things that aren't provable. So this is why Russell's paradox was so devastating to Frege, because his logical system had this situation where if you could prove a contradiction, then you could prove anything. And maybe I'll talk about this some other day, but people often refer to this as the principle of explosion, and it's very hard to not have this principle of explosion somewhere in your logic. In general, omitting it means either omitting a great deal of interesting mathematics or having a logical system that's very janky, that can prove some very unfortunate things. And to be honest, I don't really know of a logical system for mathematics that doesn't admit this principle of explosion in some way or another. So contradictions are bad. Why was Frege's system contradictory? So Frege built this very nice calculus where he had these basic propositions where a proposition would talk about the truth or falsity of a certain thing about objects. And objects were this abstract notion of the things you were talking about, the objects of discourse. And in general, there's an interplay between the objects of discourse and propositions, right? Propositions can refer to a bunch of objects and say something is true about them, and vice versa. Objects can contain or like be the extension of of a set of things um, for which a proposition holds, right? So let me give an example or two. Roughly, you could take the set of all objects that have two elements, all right? So that is itself an object, right? It's the collection of all things that have exactly two elements, right? But you see that I formed this object by talking about a proposition having two elements. And again, that set of proposition having two elements talks about objects and their properties, right? They contain two things, and those two things have to be distinct. So Frege came up with a bunch of very foundational principles, which I think I'll talk about later when I talk about set theory. But these basic principles were: how do you form propositions? How do you form objects? And one of the principles essentially was what we call unrestricted comprehension, right? It was, if you have a predicate, a proposition that talks about objects, you can form the object, which is the set of all things for which that predicate is true, right? You can take, like I said, the set of all objects that have two elements in it. And Frege used this to great effect, right? He defined the numbers exactly as that, right? The number 0 is the set of all objects that have no elements. The number 1 is the set of all objects that have one element. And all this came very naturally in his system. What Russell noticed was, if you have this kind of rule, this unrestricted comprehension, you can talk about things like the set of all objects that contain one, or the set of all objects that don't contain one. And you can even say the set of all objects that don't contain themselves, right? If you refer to an object, right, as x, or some variable that represents the object, you can consider the set of all objects such x, right, such that x is not an x. And if you think about it, right, the set of all objects says just x is not an x. You can ask this very natural question, right? Now that I've formed this object, does it contain itself? Is it this new object, which I'm going to call D? If D is the set of all objects that do not contain itself, does D contain itself, right? And the classical argument goes, well, if D contains itself, then it shouldn't contain itself, because D is exactly the set of all objects that don't contain itself, right? So if it contains itself, it shouldn't be in D, the set of all objects that don't contain themselves. But that means it doesn't contain itself, whereas we just supposed it did, all right? So now let's imagine if D doesn't contain itself, right? Then it satisfies its own predicate. It is an object that doesn't contain itself. And so it should contain itself, right? So this ability to refer to yourself, to contain yourself, or to have this sort of unrestricted set of objects that satisfy any predicate, seems to be very dangerous. And in particular, Russell showed you can really get a contradiction from that. And from the principle of explosion, you can prove any proposition. Historically, Frege was devastated. This was a huge blow. And this was kind of one of the blows that essentially destroyed logicism as a beautiful, perfect field where you could sort of lay down these uncontroversial principles of reasoning, and from those derive complex mathematical beings. Something had to give, and what had to give is basically logic had to become a little bit more complicated, and some of these principles had to be restricted at the cost of their beauty. So I'll talk eventually about how this happened and how people recovered from this paradox by creating systems that were more complicated, but which did not have this flaw, or at least as far as we know, that did not have this flaw, and weren't able to derive this contradiction.